Chapter 10. This required some serious mental gymnastics, Luke decided, lying on the sofa in the dark. The new wrinkle had been added 3 days ago. For a while there, the temptation she offered was almost more than a man could take. He'd managed to control himself. Barely. Right now he was waiting for Kat to come home from another date. A date? How delightful for her. Thanks to her, Luke hadn't had a decent date in weeks. His love life had gone to hell. He was permanently erect and would go into the Guinness Book of Records for the man with the hardest permanent erection in history. Probably for taking the most cold showers per day, too. Mr. Right? How could she have found this guy so fast? What did this jerk have that was special enough for her to abandon her lifelong dream of marriage? And could Luke be chivalrous enough to put his own needs and desires aside if Kat truly had found her Mr. Right? Just the thought of Kat belonging to chauvinist. A woman didn't belong to a man. Well, whatever the hell the term was, Luke didn't want Kat doing it with anyone. Not ever. He rolled over, dragging the sheet under him into a tangled mess. It was hot again. The door to the balcony stood wide open, a fan belligerently moving hot air around. He'd taken another icy shower. No surprise, it didn't help. He was wearing the bare minimum, cotton briefs in deference to Kat, who wasn't even home. He wished he could at least discuss this with Nick, but Nick was unusually quiet these days. Suspiciously quiet now that Luke came to think of it. He punched his hot pillow, then jerked upright, only too pleased to be off the sticky leather sofa as he paced, building up a nice head of steam. He strode into the kitchen and turned on the light. He'd bake bread. He loved to cook. The combination of science and creativity, of tossing raw ingredients into a pot and turning out something edible, fascinated him. But bread making got rid of aggression. The pounding, pummeling, and squeezing appealed to him, especially tonight. He found his favorite mixing bowl, added all the ingredients, and started kneading the dough by hand. Pounding his fists into the dough was marginally satisfying, not as satisfying as making love to Kat. But right now, that wasn't an option. And who had she gone out with tonight anyway? Pummel. Had she said? Pummel. Was it Ted? Alan? Was it Nick again? Pummel, pummel, pummel. Who was Mr. Right? It was just like Kat to throw him off the scent like this. She was doing the dating merry-go-round. Ted, Alan, Bob, Nick. Couldn't she see they were all players? Luke greased the bowl and left the abused dough to rise under a clean cloth. How did she think he could go to work when he had to stay up till all hours of the night waiting up for her? The fact that it was only a little after 9 and his usual bedtime was around 11 had no bearing on the matter. An image of 17-year-old Kat flashed through his mind. That damn birthday. He'd known she'd gone out with friends. Through the kitchen window, he'd watched her return, dancing her way across the lawn in the moonlight, looking like some delicate woodland nymph. The soft, floaty material of her dress had outlined her bare legs and snugly cupped her breasts. He'd been terrified down to his toes at the immediacy of his body's reaction. It had been the entire reason he'd kept his distance in the previous year. He'd been afraid of the magnetic draw she'd always had for him, the pull he'd thus far managed to resist. He remembered vividly thinking, run. Escape before she comes inside. Instead, he'd stood there in his dad's empty house, heart racing, anticipation churning in his gut, knowing he had only seconds to make a clean getaway, knowing he'd wanted one taste before he died, and he would die if his father ever caught him with his hands on her. The little sister he'd promised to protect. The defenseless semi-orphan he and Dad had vowed would never be hurt again. The back door had crashed open, and there she'd stood, swaying in the open doorway. "Luke, you came." She'd sounded so delighted. Her exuberance had been contagious. He'd risen, hard and ready to the occasion, and had known right then and there that he was damned. One moment there'd been a safe, respectable 10 feet of linoleum between them. The next instant, Kat had flung herself into his arms, clinging like a baby monkey. His embrace had been as far from brotherly as sugar from salt. Giving her no chance to voice a protest, he'd crushed his mouth down on hers. She'd tasted intoxicatingly sweet as her pliant body wrapped around his in the most compelling, amazing way, pressing her firm young breasts against his chest. In the 11 years he'd known her, Kat had always been reserved, always trying to remain inconspicuous. Her exuberance that night had been totally unlike her. He hadn't thought. He'd felt. With more passion than finesse, he'd pressed her supple young body against the refrigerator. Luke brushed past her to go to the cabinet where he kept his vast array of first aid supplies. A 5-year-old box of Band-Aids, a 2-year-old bottle of aspirin, and the calamine lotion. Luke was, as they said, always in rude good health. It warmed her heart to know he had the lotion, which only she used. Catherine sipped the milk without tasting it. He had the neatest, tightest little butt she'd ever seen. Luke in underwear and an apron was the sexiest thing she'd ever seen in her life. More than her skin itched. Catherine bit her lip. What did she have to do? Use Nick's 2x4 over his head? Strip naked and lie on the floor at his feet? Luke grabbed the paper towels from under the sink and came back with the pink bottle in his hand. Turn round. The first dab was nice and cold. His stiff cotton apron brushed the back of her legs as he stepped closer. What are you doing? He asked, dabbing away at her shoulders with the calamine-soaked paper towel. Undoing the halter so you can get to my neck. Stop scratching. I'm rubbing. Don't do that either. He pushed her hand gently out of his way. Then his fingers touched her shoulder as he patted downward. She felt the warmth of his breath against her skin. It made the loose curls at her nape dance and tickle her neck. Moisture prickled between her breasts, and she held her hand there to keep the top of the dress up, and her heart from jerking right out of her chest. What she'd rather do was let go and turn around. She almost clucked. She was so chicken. Her breath jammed in her lungs. She stayed as she was, back turned, and let him dot and dab at the rash. She felt like she had when she'd been a kid, standing on the highest diving board at the YWCA, her toes clenched around the end of the board, looking down at that pale blue water shimmering a mile beneath her. Wanting to jump, but sick with the adrenaline rush, breathless with excitement, dizzy with terror. 1, 2, 3. She removed her hand and let her dress drop to her waist. What are you doing? Luke demanded, voice hoarse. He stood directly behind her. When he breathed in, the fragrance of her skin blotted out all rational thought. When he breathed out, corkscrew tendrils of her upswept hair fluttered against her bare back. With a silent curse, he gritted his teeth and tried to ignore the unconscious invitation of a topless Catherine Harris. And he only had a view of her slender back peppered with cinnamon freckles, nasty pink blotches, and smears of lotion. He didn't have to see her breasts to know she was naked from the waist up. Blood rushed from his head to his groin. Unless you're going to doctor all of me, I'll do my front while you do the back, Kat murmured, open palm extended over her bare shoulder. Hand me the lotion, will you? For half a heartbeat, their eyes met. Her lashes flickered as she gazed at his mouth for a fraction of a second. Her pupils dilated just a little as she looked up, directly into his eyes. Heat sheeted Luke's body in a lightning flash rush. God almighty. Kat had no idea what those amber eyes of hers could do to a man. He knew if he inspected himself, he'd find the damned apron tented over his erection. He couldn't look anywhere other than into Kat's eyes. So near and yet so far. He wanted her so badly. But he knew if he touched her, it would just make the wanting, the needing, the ache worse. Not only would he have betrayed her trust, if he touched her like a lover, even once, he knew he'd never stop. And he'd never get over her. It would be an irrevocable step, one he would never take. But it was killing him. Wordlessly, he handed her the bottle of lotion. She half turned to reach for it, and he had a brief glimpse of the narrow span of her ribcage and one pale, perfect plump breast. His eyes shot back to her face. She seemed oblivious, and he dragged in another breath. Drenched with the scent of her, his physical reaction to her was bad enough to deal with. But this was day and night different. An odd feeling expanded through him. A feeling that had nothing to do with his rampant sexual desire for her. It felt unbearably sweet. Poignant, sinfully rich. His heart hitched, and yearning filled his soul. Then he saw himself in her eyes, and what he saw was security, safety, trust, promises made, vows kept. The thought worked as effectively as a bucket of ice water. Almost. Torture. And bless her sweet, naive heart, she had no idea. She believed she was safe with him. He let out a breath and tried to distract himself. Unfortunately, he still had her rash to contend with. He had to stand close, had to touch, had to breathe. He had to get laid. And soon. He was hanging on by the last sliver of his fingernails. She trusts me. He dabbed all the way down to the slender span of her waist, making sure only the paper towel touched her smooth skin. Can you do the rest yourself? He asked, his tongue sticking to the dry roof of his mouth. He'd go directly to heaven for his restraint, and straight to hell for his thoughts. Or do you need me to... She reached back and tugged at the short zipper at the small of her back. The sides flopped back, revealing the sweet curve of her waist, the gentle swell of her bottom, and the beginning of cleavage. He went icy hot. Jesus, did you go out tonight buck naked under this dress? Luke croaked. Oh, good. She sounded relieved. No line. I have on a thong, she told him mildly. Feels like there's a whole bunch of itchies right here. She brushed the pale flesh below her waist, well below her waist, with her thumb while trying to look over her shoulder. Can you see them? Luke prayed for an earthquake, a flood, a famine, a natural disaster, something, anything. Luke? He dabbed. She moaned as the cold liquid soothed the burning itches. He silently cursed. That should do it, right? His voice was almost non-existent, and as hopeful as that of a penitent. With both hands, she started slithering the fabric of her dress up her thighs. If you'd just do the back of my She broke off and allowed the material to fall down to cover her legs again. Never mind. Thank God he couldn't take any more. She rubbed the end of her nose with the back of her hand. I can do the rest, thanks. Did something happen tonight with... Who was it? Luke demanded. Kat sighed, put the bottle down on the counter, then used both hands to retie the straps of her dress around her neck. She turned to face him. Nothing happened with tonight's date, she snapped. He is not the problem. Luke touched her warm cheek. Longing rushed through him. He yearned to have the freedom to express all the emotions churning in his gut. He felt like an insensitive jerk. Something was wrong. He let his gaze move slowly over her tight features while she glared up at him. He dropped his hand, didn't know what to do with it, and folded his arms across his chest. She was utterly unaware of how she tied him in knots, and he'd better well keep it that way. He leaned back against the fridge, cocked his knee enough to mask the bulge in the apron, and tried his best to look unhorny. Then tell me what the problem is, Catwoman, and I'll fix it for you. My Mr. Right doesn't even know I exist. She glared at him as if it were his fault. What can you to do about that, Luke Van Buren? Needing something to do with his hands, he pulled a clean mixing bowl out of the cabinet and placed it carefully on the counter between them. He looked at her. What would you like me to do? Say the word, he said, gathering ingredients from shelves and refrigerator. He dumped everything haphazardly on the counter beside the bowl. You know I'd do anything for you. How about if you stop moving around at the speed of light and listen then? Luke leaned one shoulder against the fridge. He crossed his arms. You have to say something, Kat. Or do you want me to guess? Right. Tell you. Yeah, absolutely. Luke's eyebrows rose. He waited as she hoisted herself up onto the counter. I have a problem, and you need my deft touch. Deft touch? Catherine hooted, amused. You're as clueless as he is, you turkey. He who? Mr. Right, Luke groaned. She crossed her ankles and leaned back. The silky fabric of her dress slithered up her bare thighs. Okay, we can talk about me helping you. If you're absolutely positive... What are you doing? She gave him an innocent look. You said not to scratch. I'm rubbing. You're stroking, Luke said in a choked voice. Kat shrugged. Whatever. It feels great. This itch is driving me nuts. Hell's bells, Kat. Your itch is driving me nuts. Stop that. Tell me what the problem is and let's work on it. Kat? I'm thinking here. He clenched his teeth, pushed away from the fridge, and took out his measuring cups and the big wooden spoon he liked to use for mixing. Without measuring, he tossed butter, then brown sugar into the copper bowl. Right. What do you think I should do? Just pull out all the stops and seduce him? Luke jerked away from his mixing, as if he'd been catapulted across the kitchen. Sugar and butter went flying. Hell no! He raked his fingers through his hair, leaving glimmering speckles of sugar in the dark strands. She put up her hands. You don't have to shout. It was a simple question. You refused to help me by educating me on seduction. Now I'm on my own. The question is, how do I make him desire me? Share your vast experience and tell me. Luke stuck the spoon back in the bowl and stirred it to china. What's wrong with this Mr. Right of yours? He broke eggs into the mixture, as though he were doing intricate brain surgery. She laughed. Look, I know he likes me, but I want him to realize that he could love me. Right now he thinks of me as more of a friend. What's wrong with that? Luke demanded. That's a good place to start. Most couples start with less. Fine. Great. Terrific. But I'd like it to move a little faster than another 20 years of friendship. Something in her tone made him stare at her with added intensity. Nick. She's talking about Nick. Luke's knuckles went white around the spoon. He stood very still. How do you feel about this guy, Kat? For real. Their eyes locked, and Kat said very quietly, I love him with all my heart. For next part, now subscribe to our channel.